And we are live. Welcome, community. This is the March for Unity, Civility, and Political Engagement. I'm so glad to be kicking off another episode today, and I am super excited to be speaking with our two special guests that I will introduce in just a moment. But as I've done in previous episodes, let me reintroduce the program. We are here at the March to build better bridges between communities through listening, learning, and sympathizing, and we have themes each month. We are tackling the theme of what should I do? A question that many of us are asking ourselves to create the most positive, impactful change in society, especially with the challenges that we face today. Well, much has happened in the world since our last episode only 28 days ago, especially around the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And we will be touching on that directly in the show later. Also, on a more positive note, happy International Women's Day, a day in which we celebrate the social, economic, cultural, and political achievements of women around the world. We have the opportunity to celebrate and highlight one such woman today, the Honorable Dr. Teta Banks. Dr. Banks is a diplomat, human rights advocate, and educator. Originally from Liberia, she grew up in Detroit, Michigan, the daughter of the late Dr. Victoria Banks and Reverend Dr. A. Banks Jr., both of which were civil rights colleagues of Dr. King and Mrs. Rosa Parks. She is the president of the International Forum Incorporated and is also the immediate past chair of the United Nations Association of the USA, and is the first person of African descent to hold this position in the 30,000 membership organization's 70-year history. She is a member of the executive committee of the World Federation of United Nations Associations, consisting of 94 countries, and is the first woman of African descent to be elected to this position. It's an honor having you on our program, Dr. Banks. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for the invitation.
For sure. So excited to be chatting with you. Grant, we are also honored to have you here. Let me introduce you. Grant Hill is a mission-driven career and business strategist with extensive experience in investments, talent development, and supporting women and entrepreneurs from countries around the world redefine and succeed in their careers. Grant launched Global Impact Life to support you to take bold, practical action during this unprecedented time by bringing new ways of thinking and innovative practical steps to pivot to meaningful work. Grant, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
For sure, for sure. Well, before I get into the program, I want to offer a quick disclaimer to our folks that are tuning in, whether that's right now live on the program, live on Facebook, or maybe in the future watching the program. Please provide grace and respect to our community, especially our guest panelists, as they provide their unshielded opinions and assessments to enhance, and giving them that space will enhance the depth of our debate, especially as it pertains to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Events are changing rapidly. Something that is obvious tomorrow may be unobvious today. Also, our guest panelists may not be experts in the areas in which they are asked questions. Be kind, and guest speakers, thank you so much for opening up as we ask important questions of the day. With that, let's go ahead and jump right into the preset questions that we have. Dr. Banks, we'll start with you. International communal organizations like the International Criminal Court, the United Nations, and the European Union have felt nationalist pressures like America First, with many countries lowering their level of support of such institutions recently. As a country, how is the United States engaged with these international institutions? How should the US engage with these institutions? And beyond that, what are the limitations or boundaries of international engagement? Where does it make sense to have a national approach as opposed to an international approach? Dr. Banks?
Okay, well, you've given me 5 questions. But no, it's very important. And we see now, what's unfolding throughout Europe, we see how that impacts. What are the organizations? What is the EU doing? What is the United Nations doing? How is one country being treated versus another country and that type of thing. So let me start first with where we are as the US. We've been on a roller coaster ride these past 5 years in terms of our relationship with international organizations. We were a member of the United Nations, the Human Rights Commission. We were into multilateralism in terms of decision-making of actions that the US would take, and that was because we were part of all of these organizations. In the last administration, that administration pulled us out of it, and we went very isolationist, and many countries felt the brunt of that, and they in turn became a bit distant from the US and unsupportive. And it was quite interesting to go to conferences where international groups, because we were still participating, the citizenry, we were talking about Grant, the citizenry, we were all still participating in all these organizations, but when we would get to the session, they say, wait a second, your leadership has said you're not, it's America first. So you're doing unilateral decision-making and philosophy, but yet how are you going to support multilateralism? And that is where that distinction came, that the people of the US and the people of many of the countries, they want multilateralism because they know no country is an island. We can't exist on our own, whether we're talking about because of trade, whether we're talking about social interaction, the connections, familiar connections we have, and especially with the US, we are connected to almost every other country. So to be in isolation does not work. So we have to get back. Luckily, we're back on board with multilateralism. And it doesn't mean that we do not have concerns about our national interests. We have national interests and we have international interests. And it's not that they are exclusive all the time. There may be some things that are specific to our nation that may not go into the other realm, but that's why we have these different branches, these different organizations to address different aspects of a problem. But no nation can stand and be a partner in the global village, thinking it can only exist and only take care of its own first versus being connected in some way. And as we look at Ukraine, our hearts bleed because it's a group that was not totally connected to, the decisions of the country in terms of their affiliations and things like that's coming into play now. And that's unfortunate. And especially looking on as the UN and said, can't we do more? Can't we do this? And they'll say no, because of these agreements that we had, these multilateral agreements. And so when we have situations where the agreements supersede what actions we can take, that becomes very tragic, but hopefully we can work through that. So to answer your question, the US is involved in international organizations. We are the base of the United Nations. They are based here. Many other international organizations. We participate in other regional organizations also. So yes, we do believe in multilateralism. We are operating on that basis now. We have not abandoned, we don't do America first, as if it's isolationist, but we know and Build Back Better that the president is doing now, that we have to take care of our own infrastructure also. In order for us to assist other people, we have to be strong. So we're building our own country as well as in conjunction with other nations. And so it's a joint effort. And that's where we are in terms of our current relationships with that. In terms of where we should go, I think that we should expand the multilateralism. Yes, we need to expand also our national infrastructure. So we have enough in our structure, our governmental structure, to address both of these needs, and we have experts in both areas to do that. So we can walk and chew gum at the same time, okay? So so that's where we are at this point. But as we are a player on the world stage and we're resuming our leadership and regaining respect from other countries, because we have said, yes, we welcome multilateralism. We have gained, we've regained and gained more support from our global partners in this quest.
Thank you for touching on all of those pieces to that question, Dr. Banks. that is encouraging for me, someone that's done quite, I've been privileged and lucky to do a lot of traveling and see much of the world and be able to engage with those cultures and being able to re-engage on the level that President Biden is re-engaging these days, in my opinion, is a step in the right direction. And I think it shows to friends, both in a social setting as well as formally speaking, that the United States is committed to prosperity around the world.
And can I just add one other thing? I was just, and this is, it just popped in my head.
Sure, please.
Because we're talking about and beyond, right? I'm a Trekkie, okay? We have to think about the space, the International Space Station, okay? You're
That's
talking about not only multilateralism and international engagement here on Earth, but we are at the point now where we are venturing out and going beyond, whether we're talking about the space station, whether we're talking about other terrestrial areas. So we will have to do that in conjunction with the human beings of the Earth, so that once out there, it becomes your earthlings, right? We heard all of that in the 60s movies and all. Just like when we travel, and both of you know, when we travel to other countries, we are labeled, oh, you're Americans. We're not distinguished whether you're Indian American or African American. Oh, you're Americans. And the same thing is going to happen in terms of going into space travel, in terms of our whatever our terrestrial labeling is going to be. So that will bring us together also. So my hope is, and my concern is, with the discontinuation of the ISS in a few years, what is going to replace it? And are we going to try to do that only through independent, company or corporate ways? Or are we going to try again to do it through international, relationships and establishing that?
Sure. Well said. And you're right. Engagement with other countries does not end at the atmosphere of the Earth. We have engaged beyond that, and the ISS is a prime example of that. Well, let me turn to you, Grant. I have a preset question for you that I would love to hear your answer on. You work with social entrepreneurs that pivot into starting businesses that have greater purpose. At an individual level, what are the best practices for identifying and living out your purpose? And what has proven to work and what hasn't in this process?
Yeah, this is a great question. Thank you for it. I'll start off with the very first one, which to me is one of the biggest insights that I've ever received in me pivoting my career to meaningful work and working with others to do the same. It's just for us to be ourselves, that we don't have to go out and I don't have to go out and do clean water. I don't have to go out and do something that I think is quote unquote social entrepreneur. What I've seen by being in the field and working with a lot of people, it's whatever is in our heart, that's actually what the community needs. And one of my heroes, a woman by the name of Jacqueline Novogratz, who is the CEO of Acumen, which is a nonprofit venture fund, she says her wisdom is to follow the string of our heart. And there was a great example just recently that I saw in the news, and the gentleman's name was David Martello. And this was a German man who traveled 5,000 miles to the Ukrainian Polish border with his piano. And he was there to bring peace and hope to the Ukrainian refugees through his music. So I think this was such a beautiful example of following the string of our heart. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't even a volunteer. He was a musician. And so he was able to take what he had and he was able to bring it to the community in need at that moment in time. And so 3 simple questions that we can ask ourselves to support us to see, are we really following the string of our heart or not, is number 1, what are the challenges in the world today that I am most passionate about? And the follow-up question to that is why? Because a really big part of us on this search for purpose in our work is sometimes we have a tendency to chase other people's dreams for us or to chase society's dreams for us that are not aligned to really who we are. So what are the challenges in the world that you're passionate about and why? Number 2, what are the skills that you feel most alive implementing? And I have the wonderful opportunity to work with a client right now And she is passionate at the intersection of math, nature, problem solving, and protecting humanity. She has an incredible intellect. Her critical thinking and her imagination are off the charts. And her expertise is landslide management. And I have never really focused on landslide management before, but when I'm working with her, it comes alive so amazing. And you can see it in her eyes, you can feel it in her energy. And I'm passionate about landslide management. And that's a gift that she has to give to the community, which is amazing. And then number 3 is to ask yourself, where do you feel most drained? And wherever you feel most drained, don't do that. Many times in our work, we think that we have to do something because of money, or we're having to do something because of another situation. And if we can just take the money and we use money as a resource to implement what we're doing for the community, then we're in balance. So the very first step that I would say is to be you. Second step, as an entrepreneur, as someone who's purpose-driven, that's really here for the community, the first thing I would say, this is not an easy track. And I honor you and everyone who listens to this call for even thinking about and doing this, because it's not easy. And one of the biggest challenges that we're facing right now with exponential change is that the maps and the strategies and the tools that we had to make decisions and to make successful strategy just aren't working. And there's a great article in Harvard Business Review, and the article is entitled, "What It Takes to Lead an Exponential Change." And they discuss how our linear, rational minds have not evolved to handle the constant change that we're in. And Dr. Banks and Simmy were talking about the multinational and going beyond and all of these things that are happening all at one time. So it's vital that we tap into our intuitive mind and use our rational mind at the same time. So we're going from our heart's desire, and then we're replicating that in a very pragmatic, in a very practical way. The biggest challenge is that our schools, our universities, our business schools have not taught us how to use our intuitive mind. And in fact, we have been compensated to turn it off, because when we use our intuitive mind, we feel, and we feel about our community. And that helps us bring what the community actually needs. So the biggest benefit of tapping into your intuitive skills is that you have the most optimum choice. It gives you the skill to make the most optimum choice for yourself and for the global community. And then finally, number 3, how do I know if my intuition's clear or if it's toxic? The biggest thing that we can do is what psychologists would call shadow work. And shadow work is just consciously facing those things in us that trigger us, where we're making a reactive response instead of thinking through what's in the best interest of myself and the community on implementing it. And that takes me back to what Simmy had talked about how do we practically identify and tackle these big changes. Number 1 is to look within ourselves and to see how are we tackling them within ourselves first. How is our family tackling them? How is our community tackling them? How is our country tackling them? And then it goes into the world. And our ancestors have taught us long ago that change on the outside cannot happen unless we have change on the inside. So one of the biggest first steps to pivoting to work with meaning, especially in our civic duty and in the social space, is really doing a lot of self-work, of working within and changing within, so we can then change without. So in summary, be yourself, follow the string of your heart. Number 2, connect the intuitive mind and the rational mind. And then number 3, outer change doesn't happen without inner change.
Thank you, Grant. That was a great summary to serve as a guide for those that are interested in taking the path towards a life and career of meaning. I thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you.
And Grant, speaking of which, has taken advantage of one of the features of this program, which is the Q&A of panelists. I want to encourage our participants that have joined. Thank you so much for joining. This is the March for Unity, Civility, and Political Engagement. If you have a question for our 2 outstanding panelists, please let us know by typing into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we'll hopefully get around to asking our panelists those questions. Grant, you had a question for Dr. Banks. I'm gonna turn over the floor to you to ask that question.
Cool, I'm so excited for this opportunity. I've thought a lot about how to phrase this because I've been thinking about this a lot. So I'll just start. So and I'm going to have to read it because it's a little long. Two of my heroes are Sergio de Mello, who was the Brazilian humanitarian and the UN diplomat who was assassinated in Iraq, and Jacqueline Novogratz, the founder of Acumen, a nonprofit global venture capital fund whose goal is to use entrepreneurial approaches to address global poverty. And both of them have taught me so much about how to have a both and way of thinking, because I saw within myself how I had the tendency to lean to cancel culture at some parts. How I would judge a lot, and they have taught me a lot of how to mature through this both and. And at Global Impact Life, we are supporting two incredible women who are launching an NGO in their home country to teach the youth critical thinking in hopes to eradicate corruption in that country. And I've contemplated a lot about how do we discern when it's effective to negotiate with corrupt systems or people for the better of the whole community. And then what is the criteria required to conclude that a system or a person is so corrupt that it's time to create a whole new system? And so I have a three-part question, but I'll start with just the first question. And the first question is to Dr. Banks. I would love to hear what is your decision-making process to discern when it's effective to negotiate with a corrupt system or people for the betterment of the whole community?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I always have negotiation on the, I think we should always continue to leave the door open for negotiation. And that only means that you're open to options, you're open to listening. And one of the keys that some of my mentors have embedded in me is the key of listening. Listen and really hear what the issues are. So the negotiation part is, is it a trade-off, or, are you is it at the listening stage, or is it at the presenting stage? So there are different stages in that negotiation process. But I think that we should try to extend the negotiation as far as possible. Now, what determines when you stop negotiating? But let me back up in terms of civic action in a government that may be deemed corrupt. Then as an individual, as a person who is interested in international relations with NGOs and all, the organizations continue to work, right? So the work of the people continues no matter what the government is doing, all right? The ambassador that gave me my chart said, Teta, she said, your responsibility is to the people of that country, because the governments may change, but it is for the good of the people. So what is for the best of the people? So that takes precedent over everything else. And then if it gets to a point where it's extreme violence and detriment and, to the people, then it may be that we look for partners to assist in terms of, does this system continue? Is there an alternative system? During some of the nation's civil wars in other places, we've had presidents in exile who have worked with supporters around the world to reconstruct a government outside of that system and then return. We've also had civilians who are refugees of a country saying our country is so inoperable that so many of us have come to other countries for refuge, but we want to continue to organize and create a new constitution, an interim government, and those types of things. So the people's work continues. So it should not discourage one, if you're saying, well, my government, so what is it one person, two persons, a system is run by certain people, and we see that happening now. The people, in fact, if we take a look at Russia, we've been in communication with our friends in Russia, and it's not the people that are all involved in what's happening. So how do we manage that? We continue to communicate. We continue to get the truth out, get information to each side of it, because who knows whether any of that information may at some point spark, a new direction for something to go in, or spark an alternative that could happen. So yes, negotiation stays there. But certainly the safety of the people, the good of the majority of the people, that is foremost. I hope that answers a little bit.
Yeah, no,
yeah, and one of the situations I had specifically in mind was when Liberia was going through its civil war. You know, there was an interim government that was formed, and then groups, civilians, refugees who were here in the US, who were in the UK, in bordering countries, they were communicating so that they were assisting with, we said, because we wanted this, the sustenance of the country, but we knew that it could not continue the way it was going. So we talked about new constitutions. We talked about how do we make an interim government work. We worked with other nations who had the interest at hand, and we were able to move out of that and into stability. So yes, there was a point where we said, well, this is not working. You know, Haiti went through the same thing. When the president had to go into exile, he was collecting and encouraging international concern about Haiti at that time. And it was through that that we looked at see what is it that we need to change? How can we change certain things? Who is it that we need to bring to the table? And a key in both of those situations was having representation at the table. So if you had different sectors that were in a society and that's the conflict, then you bring everyone in so they have representation. And we find that many of the cases such as those, when people felt left out, when they felt that you know, they were pushed aside as a group, then of course that breeds, you know, distrust and social conflict. Same thing here in the US. We saw that in the last 2 summers in terms of what was going on. So wherever there is dissension, then we talk about negotiation, but I think another word that we can put in there is representation. Who's at the table? I tell people that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, okay? So we need to be at the table in a lot of the decision making, and especially as you're working, this is International Women's Day, women need to be at the table. You know, people are making policies about women and the women have nothing to say about those policies. We see it right here in the US. So that's the key, is to get that representation, and how you get that is to have the public voices out there saying that and being visible, you know, to be able to encourage those and sort of gain the attention, gain the conscience, prick the conscience of those who are working in a different direction, to see the value of not only of representation, but equality. The issue is equal voices, and that's what was needed.
So cool.
Thank you. I'm taking notes.
I am too. But Grant, go ahead with the other parts.
Well, I think that Dr. Banks answered part 1 and a lot of part 2. I would ask, just to follow up on part 2, is there any time where you would say a leader or a system is so corrupt that you can't even negotiate, that now it's time for a completely new system to take over?
Yeah,
like just the roots of the system are bad.
Yeah, and that has happened in several of the countries. And that's why they've gone to an interim government and reconstruction. I mean, even the US went through reconstruction, okay? Our system was not working. Not that it's perfect now. You know, we keep saying for a more perfect, which is really an interesting term. You know, either you're perfect or you're not, okay? But we're doing this more perfect. But that's what happens, is that you continue to work on that. And if it isn't, then you don't walk away from it. You know, you say, okay, what needs to be changed? And most times it's not the entire thing. You know, you identify where are those weaknesses, where are those areas that are creating the conflicts. How do we change that? And one of the things that I was very excited, of course, the last few years, we've become a more activist society. You know, it reminds me of the 60s, right? So it's interesting that my college students are, you know, like not excited, but it's energizing that all of these social movements and the demonstrations. And so I just say, go watch Eyes on the Prize. You see, we did it in the 60s, we did it, you know, but it, you know, it's circular. Generations have their movements and all, but you have to be careful, because one of the key questions I ask in one of my courses on social activism is this thing a movement or is it just a moment? There's a difference. So you have to have goals. There have to be, we call them deliverables. Okay, so why are we marching? So we marched to a place, and this was very interesting to me. You had these massive marches, and they would get to a place, and what was there? You know, what do you do when you get there? Are you demanding something? What are those demands? What is it listed out? What changes, concrete changes are we looking for? And that's the important thing, that we're not just spinning wheels, we're not just doing an activity, but there is a goal, there is a specific change that we're, as a group, as the civic action, we want to see this change into this. Say, and that's the difference. Do we want 50% equity, 50% representation somewhere? And it's not a thing of, oh, that's a quota and all. No, those are goals. You know, how do you know whether there's true representation? You do it by numbers. You know, you can visibly see what those are. But as we're doing all of the civic actions, when we're talking about raising women who are the most impoverished grouping in any country, raising them out of poverty, whether we're doing micro, what are the microfinancing programs that are working extremely well, then you can calculate that. How many do we want to have, come through this, and what is the end result that we want to see, that we can say, yes, we did affect this change in this amount of time, and we can extend it and anticipate, project it, that in 10 years, this is where we're looking. I mean, as much as we're celebrating International Women's Day, and I go through all the data, every year I go through the data, the one data that came up said, in terms of women gaining equity in political global power, in terms of heads of state, those types of things, that UN Women is estimating that's not going to happen until the year 2060. Now that has to change. Again, data is just saying, as we are going now, this is the projection. Then we need to change how we are going now to change that end date, okay? And so people don't get, sort of, oh, well, we have a vice president now, but look, how many years did it take for that part? But we can't go at that same pace. Okay. So yes, so we do need to, look and plan. And then in terms of civic movements and civic actions, have goals. We're going to do Earth Day in April. Okay. So what does that mean? Do we want X number of trees planted to combat deforestation? Do we want X portions of the oceans cleared, or so we have to have some concrete goals in there. And that's where the mesh comes in, as Simmy, you were talking, and Grant, you were talking. All of these different professionals can come together with their expertise and lend their expertise to developing what is it that this thing should look like. Okay.
So many good insights there. Thank you.
Many great nuggets.
Wow, I can't write them all down.
Well, I just want to commend Simmy with I Educate. Same thing. That was based on a vision, saying if we can get college students to interface with grade school and middle school students, so that those students see people that look like them, get one-on-one. We know one-on-one works with students. If we can do that, this is the projected impact we will have. And it didn't take 1 million people to do it, right? But look at the lives that are being impacted. Just by having one student achieve on that elementary level, that's going to infuse that family. That family is going to infuse that community. And then it spreads like that. I remember I had one student, it was a Hispanic student, that I had met at a community college in Philadelphia. When I went to another university and set up another program where there could be a full scholarship, I went through my listing and said, okay, these were my best students that I know all around the city, come on in. So she came in with a full scholarship. She then convinced her brother to come to college. And then they convinced their mother to come to college. You understand? And so we're talking about generational change. So it should not take a generation for these changes to happen. We can do it within our lifetimes, depending on how we go about it, how we strategize, and connecting with organizations such as we're doing here. This connectedness, so everyone is not working in a silo. What I Educate is doing, that should be shared with all school districts. Say, look at this model. And it was a nice feature that one of the news stations did. I meant to tell tell you about that. But if this is something that we are doing here, it works. So let's try, instead of saying, oh, look at the American educational system, we have all these problems. We don't have the funding, we don't have this, we don't have that. And we don't have the time to debate about, what we, and listen to what we don't have, as opposed to looking at what do we have that is working, that we could easily overlay and replicate in all of these other areas.
100%. And to generalize and give a little bit more background for our listeners that are not as familiar with iEducate, it is a program based out of Greater Houston that was founded by Dr. Rupa Gear and her son, Arun Gear, my friend and college classmate, is now the CEO and head of the program. The program provides local, successful college students to come into communities and provide mentorship to elementary school children and support classrooms, oftentimes which are overcrowded with a number of students and are underfunded. And it's a program that both supports those students financially, meaning the college students through a salary, as well as providing that mentorship and support from the college students to the children in the classroom. It's an incredible program in Houston. Well, I've taken down some, I normally don't write down notes, but this has been such a treat to hear both of you share on those topics, and I have taken down notes. Thank you for sharing. Let me quickly reintroduce both of you before we move into our last segment, which is the rapid fire response segment, in which I will be offering opinionated statements in which Grant and Dr. Banks will either agree or disagree to those statements. In the event that they do not come to a consensus on their opinion, then they will be allowed to expand on why they believe what they believe in order to foster healthy debate and understanding across different perspectives. So let me do a quick reintroduction. Dr. Banks, again, this will be very quick given the many accolades and compliments she's had, but she is a diplomat, human rights advocate, and educator, and she is the president of the International Forum, as well as the immediate past chair of the United Nations Association for the US, the first person of African descent to hold this position. She is also a member of the executive committee of the World Federation of United Nations Association. Grant Hill is my friend and also a member of the Impact Hub here in downtown Houston. He is a career and business strategist with extensive experience in investments, talent development, and supporting women and entrepreneurs from countries around the world redefine and succeed in their careers. With that, let's go ahead and kick off our last segment, which is the rapid response segment. And it's going to be broken out into two themes. The first theme, both of which we've touched on. The first theme will be the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Again, to the audience, please give grace and respect and make this a safe space for our guest speakers, as these are sensitive topics, but it's important for us to chat about them to get better understanding. The first statement. Russian President Vladimir Putin is justified to invade Ukraine. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Banks. Do you agree or disagree?
Oh, I disagree. You're talking about a sovereign nation, all right? And no country has the right to do that to any sovereign nation. So it's not just Russia into Ukraine. When the issue came up about, Africans who were, and this is sort of an aside, how the Africans are being treated and not allowed on some of the trains and all. So there was a lot of uproar in terms of, well, why are we supporting blah, blah, the Ukrainians? I said, because if one nation is able to do that to any other nation, it can happen any other place. So as we look at this example, if this is allowed to continue, or is happening, but to continue and to be successful, then no other country can really say that it is safe from such action. And I specifically was concerned in terms of African nations who have come out of a history of colonization, all right? So now you're talking about larger powers being able to say, wait a second, we want that one back because of your resources. And there are many more resources on the continent that countries are just waiting to get hold of in different means in terms of how they're going to get in there. So no, one country does not have the right to invade a sovereign nation unprovoked in terms of militarily or something like that.
Thank you, Dr. Banks. And you gave us some nuggets even before you were prompted to do so. Thank you for that explanation. That was definitely helpful in understanding your stance. Grant, Russian President Vladimir Putin is justified to invade Ukraine. Agree or disagree? I think you're on mute, but I was able to read your lips.
Disagree. I think that one of the biggest things that stands out for me and a value for me is human life. And so when you see the taking of innocent children, women, and men, and when you see this destruction, it's heartbreaking. And to think that as a leader, you would put that on people like that, no, that should never happen. Yeah.
Yeah, and I will chime in. I'm right there with both of you for many of the reasons you brought up. Second statement, Russian citizens are responsible for the invasion of Ukraine and the resulting destruction. I'll start again with you, Dr. Banks.
Okay, I would have to disagree with that because as we know, even from communicating with friends in Russia, they're not getting the information. They don't really know what's going on outside of Russia. And they were not part of the decision making. So it's not like their representatives got together and voted and represented the people, which is what we would do, here in other democratic societies. But given the evidence that we have that many of the Russians don't even know what's going on, we have Russian soldiers who didn't even know why they were there. They didn't know they were really in a war. They thought they were on the practice, all right? So the misinformation, the distrust or lack of trust that has been put into the, for the people, but mainly that the people are unknowing in many cases. And it's not the people that have waged this and in fact, you have protests there in Russia, forgot about that. You have protests there in Russia in their own streets saying, no, this is not what we wanted. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dr. Banks. Grant, same opinionated statement. Russian citizens are responsible for the invasion of Ukraine and the resulting destruction.
I disagree with that as well. And I do think, though, it shows the importance of civic engagement. I think it shows as Dr. Banks said, a lot of people didn't understand or didn't know what was going on or didn't have the influence at the time to do it. But I think it's so important that we do have civic engagement, that our businesses are actually valuing human life, that we're seeing where our monies go, because that gives us power. And when we have the civic power, then we do now have a start to say of what's going on. And I think it just highlights how important all of us on this call, the importance for us to be engaged civically and to come together to have these discussions like we're having. So we can be knowledgeable on the facts of the case so we know how to move forward.
Well said. Moving on to the third statement, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called on NATO to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine to limit attacks from Russian warplanes. No-fly zones prevent a country from using warplanes to attack military targets or civilians on the ground, but simply declaring airspace off limits is not enough. Once declared, NATO would be responsible for patrolling the area with its own planes and would have to prepare to fire at enemy ones to ensure the safety of civilians on the ground. The opinionated statement is NATO should declare a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Dr. Banks?
Yeah, this one is a tough one. My brother's a West Pointer, all right, and he does the war plans for Asia. And we've gotten in long discussions about that. And he says, Teta, this has to do with the international agreements in the past that have happened. And what we don't want is a World War III. And if the no-fly zone is imposed, that is a major step into opening the door for World War III, when we still have some other possibilities available. It's a tough call, you know, because I'm saying we can't just sit here and see this happen. And he says, wait, we have to know what these, because if we say we're going to throw all agreements out right now and nothing counts, then where do we go? So that's where we are on that one.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Banks. Grant?
You know, I would say in the beginning of this call, I wasn't educated enough to answer this question. But Dr. Banks, in her when she was sharing, did open my eyes when you were speaking about the international agreements. I didn't think about that in the whole scheme of things. And I think that also goes to show that there's so many moving parts in what is actually happening, which I think goes back to the previous question of the civic engagement, of the conversation. So we're setting agreements, and we're using our insight, our foresight, to set agreements that are going to be beneficial for our kids and our grandkids down the line. So I would agree on this one with Dr. Banks. But I'm agreeing because I was able to be educated through this. So I appreciate the format, just to be able to learn too, as we're having this conversation.
But let me just say this, though. When the United Nations was created, in its very charter, okay, the reason it was created was so that we would not have the scourge of war on future generations. I mean, that was its ultimate goal. We have seen many wars since. We have not seen a World War III, but we've seen, you know, these sparks along the way as it goes. And the whole thing was that as an international community, we have some agreements. So let's try to uphold those agreements. Now, maybe some of the agreements may need to be modified a bit. One of the issues that Putin has with Ukraine is he didn't want Ukraine to join NATO, okay? And because that protection that would have been there, so that Ukraine is sort of in the middle in terms of they're not yet members of this one. You know, the EU is stepping in a little bit. Are they members of EU? So all of these you talk about, Grant, the international organizations, there's a function for them, and there is an abiding of what those agreements are. And again, if we throw all agreements out, then what do we have? So in some manner, we have to abide by them, you know, respect them, and see how we can work through these issues and these stages, you know, keeping everything intact as we had already, you know, we had anticipated. Because 75 years ago, when United Nations put that charter together, they were anticipating there are going to be some issues, you know. Dr. King said we have some troubling days ahead, okay? So that was already anticipated. So now it's a matter of how do we handle that? And I think that this conversation that we're having, the focus on what do we do as citizens, I think this is where we come into play a lot in terms of, you know, as options, as auxiliaries to assist in all of this progress that's going to happen.
Thank you for expanding on that, Dr. Banks. And yeah, that highlights a number of points, including one that leads me directly into my last opinionated statement on this topic. I'll go ahead and read it right now. In 2008, NATO's Secretary General Jap de Hoop Schaefer, I might be mispronouncing that, I apologize if I am. He stated, we agreed that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. In December 10th, 2021, Russia's foreign minister issued a demand that NATO withdraw its 2008 pledge to admit the countries to NATO. Here's the opinionated statement. The US and allies should have conceded and worked to withdraw their pledge in an effort to prevent the Russia-Ukraine war. Starting with you, Dr. Banks.
Well, I don't think, see, I'm very skeptical when you withdraw a pledge. A pledge is a promise, and at that time, and you also have to look at what was going on historically. So at that time, that is what NATO had said that it would do. Now, it was up to Ukraine as to what it was going to do. So it rests with Ukraine in terms of making the decision. And this usurpation that has happened now has come in the midst of their making a decision to move forward on it. And that's part of the problem, that it did not make a decision at the time. And so here we are in terms of it not being protected, with that. But the other part is that when a nation just says, well, you're part of my nation, and because I claim you, and historically, you used to be part of my nation, so we're going to reclaim you. That's a whole nother, conversation. And again, it goes back to what are the legal documents between those nations, the creation of the nations and things, and those sorts of discussions.
Thanks, Dr. Banks. And Grant, I know you are not privileged to as much experience and wherewithal as Dr. Banks, and I've done a little bit of homework here, but I'll pose the same statement to you. The US and allies should have conceded and worked to withdraw their pledge in an effort to prevent the Russia-Ukraine war. Any thoughts on that?
One of my biggest thoughts is I never like to state an opinion if I really don't understand around it. Like literally what you're saying today is the first time that I heard it. So I think one of my biggest thoughts is for me to do more of my homework in this one piece. And I think so yeah, that's what I would say. Cause I hope I can defer on that one. It's just, I'd prefer to think it through a little bit more to really gain an opinion off of it.
That is valid, Grant. You're going up against, I shouldn't say against, but you are chatting with someone that's worked on the UNA of the United States. And we're privileged to have Dr. Banks on, and given the topics of the day, I wanted to see if I could fit that in there. But I certainly honor your request to defer on that.
And can I just say that I think that as we look at questions such as this, it should spur us on to say, okay, what was the history of this thing in the first place? Why is it, when the USSR, and then when it disassembled, then what happened? And then, because it's a lot of history to the sequence of all of these actions, right? And then you'll see where these agreements came in, where these sovereign nations came in, and it's been an organic time period. So a lot of changes have happened very rapidly. And sometimes we have geographic changes, we have technological changes that happen faster than some of the legal things that can happen. So I think that it's a good note in terms of how we should pay and do more. And our news should do more in terms of global news. We don't get a whole lot of global news, unless something really, bad or exciting happens. So we are sort of information-wise in isolation in terms of we just focus on America. Just like when we're with the Olympics, it was just a focus on mainly the Americans at the Olympics. I want to see everybody. What's everybody else doing? So hopefully, even in our own information sharing, we need to become much more global and much more connected, so we understand what's going on, and not only having the main news areas, broadcasting, but some of the independents broadcasting, so we get to hear the different perspectives from other places.
Absolutely. I think that's one thing that immigrants have pointed out when I've chatted with them. Hey, by the way, you guys are seeing 80% of the news is focused on America. When you step out to Europe, to Africa, to South America, maybe 80% is international news instead of domestic news. And I think that would serve us well, to your point, Dr. Banks. I know we are over, but we've had a question from one of our guests that I want to pose quickly to Dr. Banks. And I'm not sure if I'm fully understanding the question, but I'll ask it, and maybe you'll be able to connect the dots better than me, Dr. Banks. How different would things be if Russia had been offered a map, capital M-A-P, when they asked? I think that stands for some kind of a action plan to become a NATO member, if I'm not mistaken. Let me see if I can do a little bit of background. Thanks. I see the guest agreeing with me. Do you mean Ukraine instead of Russia in that question, because I don't think Russia asked for a map. Okay, really? Okay, so he confirmed that it is Russia. Again, I'll ask the question again, Dr. Banks. How different would things be if Russia had been offered a map when they asked?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, you really can't project things like that. We know that one of the critical points was that Putin did not want Ukraine to join NATO. We know that that was part of what, sparked this confrontation right now. So I cannot project what would happen if Russia was part of NATO. That would have been interesting, whether Russia would uphold its part of whatever agreement it signs. It has signed some agreements. Has it been true to those agreements? So I think that you really have to sort of dig deep in terms of what has been the pattern. And especially if you have a leader basically that we know doesn't tell the truth. So, as I'm going to do like Grant and sort of defer on this one, because I can't project, what would have happened or what the reasons were that they were not offered that. And given the time period, what else was going on that caused that? But it's a great question. It's something that I'm hoping somebody else will, go and pursue. But again, we see where we are now. So it's a matter of how do we work with, what do we do now? Okay, Simmy is like, what do all of us do now? We try to work with the civilian international organizations, try to do people-to-people type of communications, try to work with the civic and the social activists there in Russia who do want to make changes and who do not approve of the violence that's going on. I think we need to in some way connect with them and support them, or let their voices be heard a little bit more.
Thank you for that, Dr. Banks, and thank you for the question to our guests. Well, I've worked you all overtime, so I think I should start wrapping it up. Why don't we start by, let me quickly thank Diana Jang, who has been with me from the beginning. She's my partner and she supported me throughout this program, starting in 2020 to today. Thank you to my guests, the viewers that have come, including the viewer that asked the question. Thank you for your support and continuing to encourage me in this program. Special thanks to our guests, Grant Hill, as well as Dr. Banks. It's been a pleasure to celebrate International Women's Day with you both today. You both have moved the needle forward in your different capacities, and it's been so cool to have you on today and an honor to do so. With that, I would like to offer a quick 30-second plug to you, Dr. Banks. Would you like to share anything with our audience members?
Well, sure, I'll share information about the United Nations Association. It's a membership organization. Most all of our major cities have a chapter there, and you can get information on unausa.org. So not only do we do advocacy, we do educational groups, educational training, and we have educational programs anywhere from elementary all the way through the collegiate level. So we do Model United Nations. So the very things that we're talking about, if we're going to do projections, then we need to be projecting our young people today. Where do we want them to be? Do we want them to be capable of being world leaders, and what type of leaders? We have the opportunity to shape that now through iEducate, through all of our programs that Grant's doing, through our Model UN programs, so that we can be assured that the future leaders will be of a certain caliber, will have a certain social consciousness, and will have the same type of values that we want held globally through our organizations.
Well said, Dr. Banks, and thank you for encouraging us to look deeper into that incredible program and association. Grant, anything you'd like to share with the audience?
Sure, I can just share briefly about my company quickly. My company is called Global Impact Life, and we are passionate about supporting entrepreneurs and purpose-driven employees and leaders live with meaning and work with purpose. And as I spoke a little bit about the importance of bringing together our rational mind as well as our intuitive mind. We have a practical framework that assists actually how to do that, especially in the field. So you can look at our website at www.globalimpact.life. And for those also too on this call, if y'all ever want a free career pivot strategy session, you're also welcome to contact me there.
I can share firsthand that it will be well worth your time if you take Grant up on that. Thank you again, guest speakers, for joining us. Viewers, please keep an eye out for details regarding the next episode of the March for Unity, Civility, and Political Engagement, which should be delivered to your inbox shortly. In April, that will be April 5th, which we do it on a monthly basis. It's the Tuesday after the first Monday of each month, counting down to Election Tuesday, just as Election Tuesday is the Tuesday after the first Monday in November. It's at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as our work is not over at 5. Until then, thank you so much, guest speakers. Viewers, have a great Tuesday, and I'll see you all next time.
Thank you.
Bye.